My name's Aisha Kerr. I'm the Queensland Advocacy and Campaign Coordinator for the Justice Reform Initiative. I'm a proud descendant of the Quandamooka peoples with connections to Minjerribah and Morgumpin, and I'm dialing in from Meanjin today and would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people who are the traditional custodians of the land in which we're meeting on today. Yeah, Kirsten, I'll hand over to you if you're still on. I can't see you.
Oh, yep, I'm here. Sounds good. Thanks, Aisha. So my name's Kirsten. I am calling in from Aranda Country here in Mbantua. And yeah, so I'm one of the advocacy and campaign coordinators based here in the Northern Territory. We're quite lucky in the Northern Territory. We've got two of us based here, whereas most other places, as I'm sure you're aware, Aisha's all on her own over there in Queensland in quite a big jurisdiction with a lot going on, particularly in the youth justice space. So here we've got myself and then Rocket Bretherton, who's based up on Larrakia Country in Darwin. So I guess in terms of just a bit of background in terms of my work in this space, so I have worked within youth through care programs for the last few years, so working with young people coming out of youth detention in that space. I wonder, Aisha, maybe, am I okay to share my screen? And I will hopefully, oh my God, how many things do I have open that I did not think this through? Around where
nobody will judge you.
Is. Let me just close this down for a second and I will find it and open it as the sort of first
You can
one.
edit out any strange backgrounds and things.
This is how I live my life, unfortunately, is with a million things open at once. It's how my brain is working. All right, here we go. Let's share that one. And I will move to pop that onto PowerPoint. Is that working? Yes, but go back. There we go. All right. Can everybody see that shared screen?
Yeah.
There with the sort of first page? Yeah, wonderful. Love it when technology works. So the Justice Reform Initiative, we're a national advocacy and campaign organisation that have advocacy and campaign coordinators in each jurisdiction across Australia now, which is fantastic. And so really in terms of looking at that, we're working towards reducing incarceration, both in the adult and youth space. And obviously today we'll just specifically speak to that sort of youth focus. We're really looking to build the evidence base around what are the alternatives to incarceration so that we can move to an experience across Australia. And so moving away from that default criminal justice response and into what those alternatives are, so we can, reduce the number of young people, particularly in prison throughout Australia. So in terms of talking about that, I'm going to go through sort of some of the stats that we've got from a sort of national perspective, and it breaks down some of these as well. This PowerPoint that we're going to share now is very hot off the press, and it's just come through to us today. So we will hopefully in the future, in the sort of near future, be able to share it, but we just won't be able to share it immediately. We just need to check through a few additional pieces, but I'll be able to sort of talk to some of the things here, and then I'll hand over to Aisha, who will continue on. So what we're looking at here, I guess, is, so we just wanted to share really some of the considerations around the number of people, the number of children that are in prison on an average night. And so this first one here is looking at for young people 10 to 18. There's another slide that I'll share in a moment that speaks to 10 to 17-year-olds. And the reason for the difference in this is particularly, I guess, in some jurisdictions. It's not my experience here in the Northern Territory because unfortunately children here are taken across on their 18th birthday straight across into adult facilities. But in other jurisdictions, young people can continue to be in youth detention facilities past the age of 18. So across Australia, we're looking at like the number there of 822 on an average night. So then if we minimize this so I can actually see all of it, there we go, and not see myself, which helps. So then we're looking at as well the rate of change in terms of the numbers of young people that are incarcerated. So again, sort of talking to that 10 to 18 plus age range. And so what you can see here is that across Australia overall, yes, there has been a slight decline. And so that's some of the things that we see sort of in some of the media. But unfortunately, then you see jurisdictions like Queensland and the Northern Territory where that has continued to increase as well. So then, as I mentioned, this then sort of specifically talks to children. So thinking about that 10 to 17 age bracket and the numbers that we can see here. So again, across all of Australia, but then looking at some of those sort of, again, numbers throughout the higher sort of jurisdictions in terms of that. And again, we'll just quickly look at the rate of change in terms of that. So these statistics, and Aisha can potentially speak more to the sort of Queensland experience, they're not surprising to anybody from the Northern Territory, particularly when you look at that sort of increase, and that's something that we've sort of seen over that period of time. Again, noting that across Australia that there has been a very slight decrease, and particularly across some jurisdictions a more significant decrease, but then there's those outlying jurisdictions where we have seen significant increases in the numbers of young children incarcerated in youth detention facilities. So then we go on to look at, across the course of a year, what the numbers of young people that we're seeing enter youth detention facilities. So overall, that sort of number, looking at just at over 4,000 young people across the course of a year within Australia. When we then compare that with the number of young people that are released, what that shows us is the churn of young people. So I'll show you both here, young people that are released, but also the receptions into youth detention facilities. So what these statistics talk to for us is that what we're seeing is that young people are cycling through youth detention facilities. And what that means is, and it sort of speaks to that high recidivism rate that we often see within the youth population around young people that are sort of going into those facilities. And then when we think about that, the impact of what that means. So as I said, sort of looking here at those, at the receptions, so the entries into. So again, so this is both those receptions into, and I'll just flick back quickly to the releases, similar sort of numbers there to the releases. And then when we look at the individual number of children, so it's around, generally speaking, across the majority of those, it's looking at about double the number of young people that are in there. So then, and I apologize, I'm really happy to take questions afterwards as well. I'm just going to sort of breeze through this quite quickly so that we can get through quite a bit of information. But if we look at, so this is looking at the rate of incarceration per 10,000. And so again, that focus is now on that sort of 10 to 17 age range. So across Australia, the statistic is around, so it's 2.8 young people per 10,000 population. Unfortunately, you can see the very clear outlier in those statistics, particularly with the Northern Territory sitting at 19.8 young people per 10,000 in terms of our population, which is consistent across our adult population as well in terms of the rate of incarcerations that we see in the Northern Territory. Again, this is then sort of looking at that rate of change and looking at where we've seen any shifts within that. So Australia as a whole, again, we're looking at that there has been a decrease in that percentage. And then we've got those sort of outliers of Queensland and the Northern Territory where there's been a shift. So for the Northern Territory over that 10-year period, there's been a slight increase. But then what we see is that particularly in the last couple of years, which speaks to some of our youth bail legislation that we've seen come in the last sort of 2 years, that significant increase. Whereas for Queensland, it's across that sort of wider period that you guys have seen a sort of building increase over that time. All right, and now I'm going to pass over to Aisha. Do you want me to just continue sharing and you can tell me and I'll flick through?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
should be fine. I'm just going to put this little thing back on so that I
Can see.
see. Yes, I know
Doing the
it's a bit
same.
awkward, isn't it? Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I guess one thing to particularly note is that First Nations children are disproportionately overrepresented within child prisons in Australia and within most jurisdictions. You can see that for every 10,000 young people in the general population in those WA, NT and Queensland, there's around 40 young people who are incarcerated. And then on the next slide, we can see that when we compare that to the non-Indigenous youth population, First Nations children are just ridiculously overrepresented. If you compare WA, which is the highest, one per 10,000 for non-Indigenous and 44.6 for First Nations children. On the next slide, I think we also have the percentage of First Nations children within detention, and you can see in the Northern Territory, almost all children in detention are First Nations children, and then similarly those kind of top end jurisdictions, Queensland and WA, really high rates, and then it kind of decreases with the other jurisdictions. We also know that across Australia, there are a significant number of children in prison who are on remand. And basically what this means is that they're yet to be sentenced or found guilty for a crime. And you can see on the map here that Queensland, almost 90% of young people are on remand, which, you know, when we're thinking about the different ways that we could be responding to youth justice, really these 90% of young people could be in alternative programs that are within the community. I mean, really 100% of young people within detention could be in alternative programs, but it just shows our current reliance on putting kids into detention as a first response. We also know that over the last 10 years and 4 years, the number of children on remand has been significantly increasing. And this is true for the adult population as well. Oh, you're going too fast, Kirsten. I can't speak that quickly. Yeah, you can see here within some of the jurisdictions over the last 10 years in Victoria, there's been almost a 70% increase in the number of young people on remand. And then in the last 4 years as well, if you look at those, WA, South Australia, has been a really significant increase. So yeah, it really shows the need to be diverting children into alternative programs, but also, I guess, you know, speeding up court processes so that young people do have their charges dealt with in a quicker fashion. So in some of the jurisdictions, you can see that young people have had more than one sentence. And I guess this kind of relates to what Kirsten was speaking about before in terms of the number of unique young people who are in detention over the course of the year and the number of receptions and releases. So we see that on average, young people have around 2 instances of incarceration throughout the year. And I guess when we're thinking about this, what this really shows is that prison doesn't work to address the drivers behind young people's offending. Another important thing to touch on is that women are one of the fastest growing populations within the prison population. And so we have noticed that there has been increasing number of young girls who are entering detention as well. So this just kind of provides a breakdown of some of the jurisdictions. The ACT at the moment does have the highest percentage, but they also have a very small youth detention population. So I think there's about 8 young people in detention in the ACT, which is why it's a lot higher, because that's 2 out of 8 young people. But yeah, it's definitely important to highlight, given that women are increasingly being incarcerated in the adult population as well. This is just to provide a very quick snapshot of the significant amounts of money that we are spending on prison. So what I would note is that prison is the most expensive and least effective measure that we could be implementing. In Australia, we're spending around $816 million per year on child prisons. And you can see the kind of comparison in the jurisdictions there. So in Queensland, where I'm from, we're spending $218 million a year on prisons for children. On the next slide as well, we can see the percentage increase. So there's been, in the Northern Territory, 274% increase in the amount of money that we're spending on prison. And even in some of those jurisdictions where you have seen a decrease in the number of children going to prison, we're still seeing an increase in the amount of money that's being spent on these services. If we go to the next slide, we know that the daily cost, and on the next slide I'll talk about the yearly cost of keeping a child in prison, is far greater than what alternative community-based programs would cost. So if we just flip back to the other side, sorry, back the other way. Oh no, Cassidy, you're terrible at this.
I'm bad at this. What have I done? Where have I gone?
So I think it's around, from memory, $2,700 per day in Australia-wide to keep a child in prison. And in Queensland, my jurisdiction, it's $2,000 a day, which we actually, here I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe we're spending that much. But then if you look at other jurisdictions like Victoria, it's $5,000 a day. And then on the next slide, some jurisdictions are spending up to $1.8 million a year per child in detention. In Queensland, it's $760,000 where I'm from, which, when you think about the amount of money that is for one child to be held in prison for a year, what difference that money could make if it was instead invested into community-based services, or even if one child's family was given $761,000 worth of services, like that's probably too much money for the services that they need. So yeah, it really shows how expensive prison is in comparison to community-based alternatives. That's again just showing the cost per child per year and the increase we've kind of seen over the last 10 years and the last 4 years. So some really significant increases over the last 10 years in most jurisdictions. A lot of the time when we're speaking about the way that prison fails to keep the community safe, people ask us, well, if prison doesn't work, then what does? And we've recently released some reports in the Northern Territory and Queensland and some of our other jurisdictions that look at evidence-based alternatives to incarceration and what are some of the other changes that we could make across the life course of young people and at every kind of touch point of the criminal justice system. So when we're talking about children and young people, there's a couple of different key areas. So early intervention, which really focuses on addressing risk factors early in a young person's pathway onto offending. And really, I guess that's stopping behaviours before they become too entrenched. Alternatively, primary crime prevention really focuses on intervening early within a community to address factors that might lead young people to offend. So I'll provide an example of that in the next couple of slides. Then we have alternatives to custody. So this might be diversion at the point of police or court interaction. So rather than a police officer arresting a young person and sending them straight to detention or prison, they could instead be referred into an alternative diversion program that wraps supports around them and their family. And similarly, sentencing alternatives as well. So when it comes to that point of the young person being sentenced, rather than them being sentenced to prison, they could be sentenced to an alternative community-based program. And then, you know, whilst the aim is really to have all young people diverted away from the justice system, we really need to be making sure that for any young people who are going through the youth justice system through detention, that there is that post-release support and through care. So rather than, you know, we hear stories now of young people leaving prison in Queensland and they walk out the door and they're told to go on their way. And really what should be happening is that young people should have intensive supports and engagement even after they leave prison, to make sure that they are kind of supported within the community to not re-offend. And I will just mention there as well, you know, there is a really significant need in Australia, Queensland, other jurisdictions for First Nations led alternatives as well. You know, there's communities have the solutions, but I think at the moment what is lacking is political will to invest that money in community-led solutions. This is a really quick snapshot, which basically just provides an overview of the evaluations that have been completed, the impact that they have had of programs that are community-based. So in early intervention and prevention programs, and this is all within our reports, so we can send out the links to our reports if you're interested in reading more, but we've seen a 6 to 48% reduction in antisocial and problematic behaviours within young people who complete these programs, and a 2 to 5% annual reduction in crime at the population level. Tertiary responses, which are basically interventions that happen after a young person might have had interaction with the justice system. We've seen between a 33 and 45% reduction in crime, and up to 95% of young people who complete a program that don't reoffend. Meanwhile, pre-sentence detention, which is what we were talking about before in terms of young people being held on remand in prison, has been associated with a 33% increase in reoffending or recidivism for young people. So when we're thinking about what works to reduce crime and keep the community safe, really it's a no-brainer that we should be investing in these community-based services. And I think this is the last slide, but this is just a really quick snapshot of some of the programs that are in our report. So early intervention and early prevention, there's so many different programs that can be implemented: home visitation programs, parenting programs, sport programs, mentoring and after school programs. All of these programs at both ends of the spectrum, I guess, what they have in common is that they address the drivers of offending, and they wrap supports around children and their families to support them rather than criminalising them. But yeah, as I said, all this info is in our report, so very happy to send the links out to that. And if you have any kind of follow-up questions, or you're interested in kind of learning more, speaking more with us, we're more than happy to do that. I've put our emails up there, and also I assume young people mostly are on Instagram. The Twitter's there. I don't know if young people use Twitter. I didn't get it until I started in this job. So, but yeah, very happy to kind of take questions as we get into the discussion.
That's so great, Aisha. Thank you so much for that overview. It was really great to see that all in one place. I'm sure people do have questions. We haven't had anything come through, but I'm going to, I have questions, of course, but I'm going to hand over to Tom. Catherine's still here. So if you did have anything to add, Catherine, I know you have to leave. That would be great if you wanted to have a quick.
Yes. Thank you for accommodating. I've got to say I'm at home this afternoon. I've got barking dogs, and I've got to go soon. So sorry about that. But there's a good example of the Queensland context up here, because everybody knows that there's been a big government response to the perceived youth crime crisis. There's new laws that were introduced earlier this year, and what those new laws have done is made it an offence for a young person to breach their bail conditions. And I'll just break that down for you. So what that means is that the bail conditions that are set by a magistrate for a young person, which could be anything from having to attend school, having to stay at a particular address, having to attend a particular appointment, if the young person doesn't comply with that condition, then they've committed a criminal offence. So it's criminalising otherwise non-criminal behaviour, which we have an obvious concern about. We've got this is the most adorable young Aboriginal boy who comes to our office very regularly. So he's a 13-year-old homeless young boy. He lives on the street not far from our office. He comes in quite regularly. He's tiny, big brown eyes, great sense of humour, easy to engage with. You just want to hug him and take him home with you. He's just adorable. He is on bail for armed robbery. He held up a convenience store with a Stanley knife. He was after food and some money just to get by because, as I said, he's been homeless now for about 6 months. One of his bail conditions is that he must go home to his home address, but his stepfather is abusive. So this means it's now a crime for him not to go home to the abusive home that his mother and stepfather reside at. So that's just a really horrible example. And I think that it also shows what Aisha's been talking about, and Kirsten, about that perfect storm of circumstances that contributes to these situations. So this little boy's homeless on the streets. He's in that gap where below 16 years old, there's nowhere for him to go to. A lot of places won't take, nowhere takes under 16s. He's supposed to be in the care of child safety, but he's fallen between that gap. He talks about smoking meth. I really hope that that's just bravado, but he does talk about that a lot. And he has come from a background of family dysfunction. He doesn't have grandparents around. And as I said, there's a possibility of abuse from his stepfather. There's also school disengagement. So he's a bright boy. He's obviously someone who could have a productive life, but he hasn't been at school for longer than he's been homeless. So that's come out to about 8 months now. So to put that safety net beneath kids like this requires, in my view, the Department of Education, Department of Health, Child Safety, Youth Justice, all of those resources, plus the community sector, to all come beneath him and help him avoid that path that he's on at the moment, because at the moment it looks like an inevitable outcome. It's just such intensive work that's needed. Work would need to be done with his family to try to get that family dysfunction addressed and try to get him somewhere where he has a foundation and a base to go from. So that is just, for me, it makes my heart just break when I think of the circumstances that he's in and the impact that these new laws have had on him. It's an awful situation, but he's the face behind the figures that Aisha and Kirsten have been talking about. Helen, I saw a comment come up. What did you say? Was that something you wanted me to answer?
No, I was just adding your website.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That was all I was going to talk about, just about that real human face behind these awful laws. But thank you, Aisha and Kirsten, for that, talking about the terrible statistics. It's something that has to be done.
Yeah, I love that you were able to share that story, Catherine. Thanks for that.
I was just going to jump in there, Catherine, and say, I guess one of the things that you see within those NT statistics are that we had, similar to the Queensland laws around breach of bail becoming an offence, that's happened 2 years ago now in the NT. And so that's where you see that significant increase. So we had managed post-Royal Commission to drop the numbers of young people in youth detention, and then that's significantly risen in the last 2 years. So it's been a really horrible impact. So I feel for you guys in Queensland, because I guess that's the trajectory that I would see that is coming for you guys.
Well, how long did it take to have that impact? Because I've been a little bit optimistic that it's not so bad yet.
Okay. Look, we probably did see it very quickly. So they came in May of 2021, I'm going to say. And yeah, it was fairly quick, within a couple of months, that we really saw that significantly increase.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Kirsten.
Not a problem.
I'm going to have to leave because I'm on pickup duty this afternoon, but thank you everyone for your time.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, we'll be And I guess it's a good time to hand over to Tom, because you've done a lot of advocacy around those new laws in Queensland, and you probably have. I was just thinking in terms of what we've heard and the things that we are all going to be wanting to include in those submissions. So what are the answers? And we've got so many of the things are in those reports from the Justice Reform Initiative, but also changing the bail laws and whatever you want to add.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Helen. Thank you to everyone for joining. It's probably really great that we were to frame this discussion around those statistics, considering they're so contemporary and have such an impact on so many people in our space. It's nice that Catherine's also able to share a story that gives a face to those statistics, because that's just one young person, but for every single number that we saw in the Justice Reform Initiative's presentation, there is a similar story sitting behind every one of those. Just on the breach of bail, one thing I think is really important from the context of advocacy is that there's been some media reporting that's come out that's shown the disproportionate targeting of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people in terms of who is being caught for breach of bail in Queensland. And I can't remember the exact numbers. I'll find them and share them, but it's staggeringly disproportionate in terms of the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people being breached on bail and being returned to detention, which was always going to happen. And it always will be, because I think our system, a lot of people talk about the youth justice system being broken. I've often heard that the youth justice system is doing exactly what it was designed for, which is to lock up Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. And we need a different system designed for a different purpose. We can't just say that it's a broken system. It's probably working quite effectively. It's just doing the wrong thing. One of the important things to consider around advocacy and kind of challenging, I guess, writing a submission that's looking to consider positive change in this space is to think about what are the actual contributing factors to this issue. So some really clear contributing factors that need to be addressed, and some of those can be addressed nationally. We're writing a submission here for a national audience, so they've got to think about the national levers that can be addressed, rather than just some of those that sit squarely at a state level, because that will be what is of particular interest to the kind of the National Children's Commissioner, who's been very outspoken on this issue. A big one is the additional supports and recognition required for young people experiencing fetal alcohol spectrum syndrome. That's significantly underreported, undersupported, and underinvested in terms of how young people are supported around fetal alcohol spectrum syndrome. From what we understand, it is more prevalent than autism in Australia, but really gets none of the recognition, and particularly considering the behavioural ramifications for those who experience it, you do require very different interventions for young people who have that experience. It is a disability and needs to be supported as a disability, and a very large number of young people in detention do have that experience. A really big one that's driven and can be driven nationally is a redesign of the education system to stop disproportionately expelling young people who experience disability, have an out-of-home care experience, or are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So in Queensland, if you are sitting in those three categories, you are 840% more likely to be suspended than any other student in Queensland. So if you're an Aboriginal student with a disability and out-of-home care, it would be very unlikely that you weren't suspended at some point in your educational journey. Particularly worryingly, the suspension rates that sit in the very early years. So we know that as soon as young people start being suspended in their primary school years, particularly prep in year one, that's leading them to a kind of, I think they call it a pipeline to prison. And they call it that for good reason. So that's a really significant driver of the more we can keep young people engaged in inclusive education, the more protective factors you wrap around a young person, the more you set them up for success. As soon as you see them disengage from education, the warning signs just increase dramatically. Exposure to domestic violence. If you are writing a submission, make sure you are referencing the very contemporary and alarming statistics from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, particularly the cohort that are 16 to 25, where I believe it's around 44% reported exposure to domestic and family violence in the home. To Catherine's point, and to the majority of cases that we see, domestic and family violence exposure, witnessing that kind of not being able to return to a safe home is one of the leading causes of young people being remanded into detention. I was on the radio the other day, and one of the radio hosts asked me kind of that she was driving to work. It was a breakfast radio kind of very early in the morning, and saw all these kids hanging out to about 3 o'clock in the morning, and asked why. And I said, well, potentially that might be the safest place for them. The streets for a lot of young people are safer than their homes. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we've gone so far in our responses to domestic and family violence. 10, 15 years ago, we probably had a very different response. But we've made really significant inroads, and that's a pathway that the youth justice response could mirror in terms of building a public campaign around a different community response. Exposure to substances, substance abuse is kind of phenomenally profound and impactful on young people, particularly chroming, what we're seeing now in vaping. And vaping, we don't know what those long-term effects are, but one of the things that I'm really mindful of, because I also represent the child protection space, is the incidental criminalisation of young people in out-of-home care who are caught vaping. So what we see more and more is young people in the out-of-home care system have an additional level of, I guess, oversight and supervision, and police tend to be called out a lot more frequently than would otherwise be the case. So for young people who are in a family-based care setting, you probably aren't going to call the police out for half the things that would happen in a residential care home. So there is an overt criminalisation just based on the fact that there's too much, well, there's a lot of supervision occurring, and it's a professional supervision. Vaping, I believe, will lead to a significant influx because it is very pervasive, and it is illegal for a person under the age of 18 to be doing it. And it's looking at that in terms of how we look at alternative models. There's probably more therapeutic treatments we can have than charging someone for doing it. Similar to smoking and what happened with smoking. Surprisingly, even the more simple things like nutrition and lifestyle need to be considered. How are we actually setting young people up to have healthy nutrition and more healthy and kind of pro-social lifestyles? All of those things need to be considered, because if you can get that right from birth, particularly in the really early years, brain development, kind of normal pro-social behaviours, all of that kind of is really influential in that first kind of 5 years. So it's not to be understated in terms of that, in kind of focus in on good nutrition, good lifestyle choices, good role modeling. So how are we teaching our parents to kind of be good role models to start breaking those cycles that we see? And we've probably spoken about this, and it needs to be addressed nationally, and it's a huge national lever, is the experiences of young people in homelessness. That's the most alarming thing that we're seeing in Queensland, is the pervasive nature of homelessness. But it's way more than rough sleeping. And a lot of homelessness people perceive as just the rough sleeping that happens around us. The majority of homelessness is around unstable and unsafe accommodation, and people who aren't sleeping rough but have no stability. It's very difficult for any family to think about kind of the future when they don't have a safe roof over their head or don't know where they're going to get their next meal. So they're the things that I'll be thinking about in terms of how you address the contributing factors. A key message that I always speak to in terms of my advocacy is you can't fix youth justice by treating the consequences of it. You've got to take a step right back through to its causes. And the youth justice system is not fixed by youth justice departments. Youth justice responses are fixed by education and health and early childhood education. It's all of those upstream influences that will see a reduction and a benefit through to youth justice as a response. But you should not be lobbying a youth justice system to try and change itself from the ground up. You need to take a step back to those systems of influence that are right from the earlier stages of a young person's life, or prior to their life, the stages of their parents. I might pause there just to see if there's any questions.
Can't see any questions coming through on the chat. Can anyone else? Oh, I've just closed it. But I mean, it's interesting what you say, Tom, because it's the same work that many of us are doing, and I'm sure many online are doing. So we're sort of in the child abuse space as well. So we're following the Australian maltreatment study, and it's the same thing that in the past people have talked a lot about the child protection system. And you know, for one, it's one very small percentage of the kids who are experiencing harm, but also, yeah, that's not where the fix is, and systems do what they're designed to do. So I did have a question for all of you about in terms of the therapeutic response. do we have those, like, are those services there? I mean, so much money is being spent on the jails. I know there's a sort of thing, the jails are built and they're there, and are some jurisdictions doing a better job of providing some of that stuff in that juvenile justice system?
That's probably an excellent question for the Justice Reform Initiative. But just in my perspective, and I've been really open about this, I think that a therapeutic early intervention does not start once a young person enters detention. Anyone who claims that early intervention works best when a person interacts with the system is missing the point of the early intervention. It needs to happen way upstream of any interaction. There's diversionary services, but that's not early. It's getting right at the start. And any therapeutic detention models, they talk a lot about them. I've never seen a very good one. It's got to be therapeutic and community-based to be working well, and it's got to be diverting people from offending behaviours, not just responding after they've had them. But I'll be keen to hear what the Justice Reform Initiative have to say about that.
Would absolutely support what you're saying there, Tom. I mean, I think in terms of working within those spaces, and I know that a number of places are sort of working on models of care and talking about therapeutic models of care within child prisons. Really, like the experience of a young person within that facility, they're not experiencing safety in any way that can be conducive to an experience of something truly therapeutic and healing, in my opinion. So I think that, yeah, as sort of Tom's alluding to, it really needs to come in that sort of much earlier space. And I guess one of the things that I would really touch on in terms of that is something that one of our sort of colleagues here that's working in this space and working with young people, both in bail support facilities and youth detention at the moment as an external organisation, has said to us, which is that, so this is a First Nations led organisation, and they've really sort of pushed that, like, please stop funding us to run your programs and invest in us to run our own. And those words will continually stick with me, and really sort of supportive of the work that they're doing. So that's an organisation called King's Narrative that have started up here in Mbantua and are doing some incredible work.
I would just add to that as well to say that I think in Queensland we've seen a real piecemeal approach to funding early intervention and alternatives to custody. There are no primary crime prevention programs in Queensland. So there is, within our report, Communities That Care, which basically is a program, a place-based initiative that could be implemented in any community. And it's about bringing the community stakeholders together to implement evidence-based solutions to intervene early to prevent crime from happening before it even starts. I think there has been, in Queensland in particular, there has been an increased investment in community-based programs over the last couple of years, but that has been piecemeal, and also services aren't funded in a way that allows them to provide the support that young people in our communities need. So if Catherine was still here, she would probably say that their service is turning away young people because they just don't have the resources and the capacity and the funding to support the amount of young people who are engaging with the service. We've had conversations with other service providers in other jurisdictions who are in similar circumstances. We've also seen in Queensland this really heavy investment, as Tom kind of alluded to, into tertiary responses when young people have already had that interaction with the justice system, and what Queensland is labelling as serious repeat offenders. Most of those services that the government has invested money in are run by the government themselves, and there isn't really this transparency in terms of how those programs are operating, and the outcomes that they're having. We have seen some evaluations that have started to be released by the government, but I think what we've been calling for and what our report talks about is that we really need to be significantly increasing our investment in community-led programs and organisations who can provide that support to young people and their families to address the drivers of offending, rather than funneling all of that money into an ineffective prison system.
That's great questions. 2 questions in the chat. One,
Yeah.
what percentage of Aboriginal children experience things such as homelessness? That's one that you've got to really look into in terms of the location itself. It's going to change dramatically depending on which state you're in, within metropolitan and regional areas. But what we know from the statistics is kind of there's more than 100,000 people and growing in Australia experiencing homelessness on a daily basis, and about 20% of those are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. It's probably really important to acknowledge when if you are including that kind of thing in a submission, is that there are very different definitions of homelessness depending on cultural considerations. And you've just got to be mindful of how you frame homelessness from the context of culture. And just be respectful of that, because some of the early accounts that were made probably overinflated different cultural groups in terms of homelessness versus having been housed. The question from Jade, which is around kind of how do you advocate for better models when you're looking at kind of alternatives where detention centres have been shut down, is a great question. I was really heavily involved in the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, and was really fortunate to have worked for government for a number of years in standing up responses in the child protection space. I could not recommend strongly enough the alternative assessment models that you can put in place to replace detention. Young people and prisons don't work very well. It just makes them kind of better offenders. What you need is to have alternative assessment centres that are community-based, that respond to need. They're small, they can be therapeutic in nature. If we've got 9 out of 10 young people in detention on remand, they're actually keeping a separation between those who are subject to a detention order and those who are on remand, because it's not safe for them to be somewhere else. That's the stuff that sits in the Justice Reform Initiative's report and models. They're a much better model. They're also aligned to the evidence of what we see overseas. So I think that's the model I would be advocating for as an alternative to detention. You've got to be mindful that from a public perspective, there will always be a driver for detention and prison-based models, because it makes people feel safe. And it makes people feel like people are being punished for their wrongdoing. And that's a really strong psychological lever. So a lot of our work in the advocacy space is to do the myth busting around this work. So a lot of our work needs to be in challenging public perception, because government doesn't respond to the facts as much as it responds to public perception, how the facts are interpreted. So I spend a lot of time, and Catherine as well, we met with the Minister this morning, and politicians for the most part are pretty reasonable people, but they need to respond to political pressures and public pressures. So it's around how we as a community and how we as advocates can help shift the community discourse to create an opportunity for politicians to make more moderate and reasonable evidence-informed decisions. Because I think they do want to make them. They just need that space to be able to do that well.
And the second bit of Jade's question was also about how to get involved. So you might all like to quickly do that too, because there are opportunities to be part of this, I think.
Yeah, look, from the Justice Reform Initiative perspective, we do have a petition on our website, and within that petition, there's an option to elect if you would like to volunteer, and some of the things that we're looking at. So next month, I'm going to some of the open days here in Queensland, and at the moment it'll just be me running those stalls and talking to people about the ways that jailing is failing and what some of the alternative models might look like. We also sell our Jailing is Failing merchandise, so if you want to get involved in that way, you can go onto our website and buy a t-shirt or a tote bag. But yeah, like we're looking and kind of exploring options for ways that students or people in the community who are keen to get involved could help us at some of those events, or contribute in other ways to our work. So I'm on a QT steering committee meeting here, and was talking to the people on that about how we can get uni students involved in maybe supporting some of the research that we do to contribute to our reports. And then kind of goes back to what Tom was just saying. I think, you know, the way that we will get to a point where we see significant changes if we bring the community along the journey with us, dare I say the word journey. And I really think that every person can have those conversations, whether it's at the dinner table with their friends, you know, anyone that they're interacting with about this. And, you know, even as someone who works in this space, sometimes those conversations can be yuck, particularly when, you know, the people that you're speaking to, you know, might have a different view to you about prison and its effect. But really, the only way we are going to make change is if we just keep continuing to have those tough conversations and keeping the conversation going about what an alternative model could look like. And we also have these amazing reports on our website, which are a good reference if you're looking for some more information about, you know, the sorts of things you could be talking to people about.
That's great. I can see you've got your hand up, Shireen. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask, I was interested to know if the impact of COVID has been looked at in terms of the effect it's had in terms of increasing domestic violence at home, increasing disengagement with school, all of those factors.
It's a great question. And we're starting to see some evidence come out around that. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that we see, and particularly parallels to child protection. So I work very extensively across the child protection system, as well as the youth justice system. But what we saw in child protection was a significant drop in the number of reports of young people in need of protection, because there was a lot less eyeballs on young people, particularly when schools. I was one of the strongest advocates for keeping schools open, because schools are one of the strongest protective factors for children at risk of harm. So while a lot of people were championing the idea of them being closed for a while, they are one of the most important the teacher is sometimes one of the most stable influences in a young person's life. So what we have seen in the child protection space is a drop in reporting, a drop of visibility, a real isolation of people within their community and home, and a pervasive sense that isolation continues even though we have come out the other side to an extent from COVID. So we kind of haven't regained that sense of community collegiality. We are seeing greater levels of violence in offending behaviours for adults and young people. We're seeing less offending, but the offending we are seeing is more violent. And that can be triggered through that sense of isolation and fear that's fostered when we've got global pandemics. So I think there's a direct correlation to the type of offending that we're seeing and the sense of need for community that young people strive for in some of their offending behaviours. But I think it's something that will continue to be very pervasive, but it's a lot around the social isolation that we probably didn't really anticipate was going to be as much of an issue as it become.
And from anecdotally again, everyone who I'm speaking to in terms of friends who are psychologists and who are working in the youth space are telling me that the amount of self-harm, the amount of depression, the amount of anxiety that they're seeing in young people post-COVID, it's just they can't cope. They can't cope. There's not enough psychologists in Australia to deal with it, with the amount of young people who need help. So I would think whether it's in the youth justice system or if it's out in the community, there's just not enough help out there.
Absolutely. The amount of mental health support needed in Australia is phenomenal at the moment. And we just can't keep up. We can't have a workforce big enough to keep up with the need. And we see that manifest particularly with young people through their behaviours, because a lot of the work we do in my space is around the idea of helping people understand that for young people, challenging behaviours, problematic behaviours is a form of communication when they haven't learned how to communicate in a more pro-social way. They don't have the language to express their emotions, so they seek to express that through their behaviours. And unfortunately, they get caught up in these systems.
And it's interesting, though, that fundamentals like teaching kids about self-regulation is nowhere in our curriculum. It's nowhere about how to regulate your emotions, particularly. And if you're not getting that at home because your home is is, you know, filled with domestic violence and, you know, and dealing with issues of poverty and so many other things. How are you supposed to learn about how to actually regulate yourself?
Absolutely. And I think that's another lever for submission when you're looking at education is the national curriculum, in terms of how you're bringing this in around kind of healthy relationships with yourself and others. You need to be thinking about, particularly if you're writing a national submission, it's got to be national levers. So what is the impact on kind of year on year of rate increases on families and poverty and experiences of pushing people into poverty? Even today, we've had another 0.25% increase. That pushes another group beyond the poverty line. It's the anxiety and stress within the home that bubbles out. And that's the national lever that can be addressed. Because that's what they will be interested in. The National Commission will be around what can they do nationally. I don't have a particular position on whether this should be a nationally responded to issue. I think states should take a real leading role, but I think there's an important place for the federal government and a national voice to be driving this change. You saw the statistics on Queensland. Queensland's leading the way in terms of how not to do it well. And other jurisdictions are actually doing a great job in this space. So it's how can states learn from each other?
That's great. Thanks, everyone. It is past 5:30, but if people are happy to stay and have burning questions, I don't want to keep people too long. But and thanks to everyone in the chat. But a few people are sharing a bit of the work that they do, so feel free to do that. That's really welcome, and we'll sort of keep track of that. Because we didn't have registrations, I don't have like a list of everyone who attended to be able to share things afterwards. So do check the chat. I've shared some of the justice reform reports and things like that. And I think just a general thing, Merrin and I were both in a webinar yesterday that was about how we talk about how we frame social justice issues. And the biggest recommendation is that we do need to start with giving people solutions. And that's why I'm so grateful to have these reports, because when we are trying to talk to people, and whoever it is, as Aisha was saying, we have these conversations all the time with people in the street or whatever. When you have some story of something that's worked and you can confidently tell people that jails don't work, but this does work. Oh, there's this amazing thing. That's where you kind of get a little bit more buy-in from people. Those recommendations tend to say, don't start with all the terrible facts. We started with the terrible facts today because we're all clever people who are not going to get disengaged. But in general, it's really good to have those positive stories. And as Tom said, even politicians that are wanting to do the right thing, we have to give them that information in a way that that really sells it. So we're really interested in that, and I think that is some of the work that we all have to do. Let's see if there's are there any other questions coming through? Oh, and I did want to say, Oliver, Claire just reminded me, but Oliver did have to leave earlier. He actually had to go to an event at the Human Rights Commission, so we will let him be excused for that. But we just want to really thank everyone for coming along. And yeah, do we want to anything else people would like to say?
Just one thing to touch on, which we haven't really spoken about in terms of, and this is something we're really mindful of in terms of the broader changes that we're seeing in the intersection between youth justice and child protection, is we expect over the next 5 to 10 years that we're going to see a massive shift in foster carers, and not a good one. So foster care as a model will start to decrease because the typical foster carer is kind of changing. So because of cost of living, because of differences in families, you have less kind of single income households. It's more expensive to buy a house with a spare bedroom. So all of those small things mean that less and less people will be inclined to take on a foster caring role in an altruistic capacity. But what we are seeing, you're starting to see some media reports, is the emergence of, or the re-emergence of this idea of professional foster care. So people who are therapeutically trained and paid a living wage, a reasonable living wage, to actually undertake the care of a young person. So there's really good models in place that work really effectively. for people to professionally, and their job is to look after a young person, 1 or 2 young people, and particularly for young people who have challenging behaviours, that can be a really strong model of care to keep them out of a detention system. So I think it's something we need to look at as how can the federal government use that as a driver? It's actually a lot cheaper than a residential care placement or a detention placement. What we see is on average, it might cost about $250,000 a year for a professional foster care placement. It's $500,000 a year in residential care, and we've seen the prices for a year in detention. So although it seems like it might be expensive, it's actually half the price of any other model and about twice as effective. So we've got to look at alternative models of how we can provide care for young people who sit in that really vulnerable space, because if they can receive the right level of therapeutic care in a home-based setting, that's a really strong protective factor to keep them out of the justice system. So just one to think about as an alternative model that we know was going to need to emerge as foster care decreases.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it just reminded me of something else you said earlier, Tom. You know, like it's not hard to identify these kids very, very early on. And I think PeakCare held a really great forum about suspensions in schools. And it's ludicrous how we say, oh wow, this is amazing, this is happening, this child is behaving this way. We knew way back, and we know the families that are in need. So we just need to find those ways to do the primary prevention and wrap around the support for those families. So yeah. So Kirsten, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to jump on that in terms of, I guess, children in care and that space, and something that's really being pushed by certain areas here is around the like kinship care models, and really sort of moving much more into that space, which unfortunately is not happening yet in the Northern Territory. But that's definitely something that our Children's Commissioner here is very keen on, and something that she really advocates for. And in terms of talking about things that are cost effective, and absolutely sort of having that wraparound care of a young person, and particularly in terms of their connection with culture and with family, and what that can provide for a young person is something that we're definitely sort of within a number of different spaces across the Northern Territory really advocating for. So that's another consideration, I guess, for people in terms of those sort of thoughts around children that are in care.
Great.
Yeah.
One thing that needs to be considered is that for kinship care, it can't just be support for the young person, it's got to be support for the entire family as well. Otherwise, because that's where you acknowledge that kind of the family themselves needs support to stay as a placement. Something Queensland, I think, hasn't grappled with very well in the kinship space is kind of you've got to make sure you're wrapping around the entire household, not just for the young person. But great suggestion, Kristen.
Absolutely.
All righty. Well, I'll wrap it up. Thank you so much to everyone for coming, for all the listeners and hanging in there with us, but and especially to our panel. Thanks, Aisha and Kirsten and Tom, and to Catherine earlier, and to Oliver, who also had to leave. Yeah, it's been really very insightful, and we look forward to sort of being able to keep working together and keep that momentum going. Yeah, thank you.